Hi, thank you for tuning in to the first episode of Watershed Moments podcast. I'm Heather Dyer, CEO, General Manager of San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District, but you can call us San Bernardino Valley for short. Over the next few months, we will be sharing conversations with different partners about their key watershed moments. This two-part series was recorded last fall, shortly after the line and bridge fires, but before the devastating Palisades and Eaton fires. Our hearts go out to all of those affected by these wildfires. California's forests and watersheds are facing unprecedented challenges. In this episode, we are fortunate to chat with San Bernardino National Forest Supervisor Dee Harrison. We explore the realities of wildfire recovery, forest management, and the steps needed for all of us to take together to protect our state's most vital natural resources. Thanks for joining. Thank you, Dee, for being my first guest on Watershed Moments. I want to first just say how appreciative I am that you are willing to take the time to do this, because I know it's a big commitment and a little bit scary, but I think it is such a great opportunity for us to really celebrate leadership in this watershed and all the fantastic things that are going on. So thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Heather. And I'm really excited today for, first of all, just to spend time with you. Speaking of watershed work and watershed health, to have someone who's a really great partner in those efforts. So thank you for having me.
Well, let's get started a little bit about Dee. So, Dee, you are the forest supervisor for the San Bernardino National Forest here in Southern California. First off, not everyone knows what the Forest Service does or why you exist. So, why don't you just start with what is a forest supervisor and what is your job?
Oh, that's a great question. I've still been trying to explain that to my parents for the last 20 something years. So I work for the US Forest Service, even though technically we're the USDA Forest Service these days. And so the agency, it's national, so we're a federal entity, and we've been around since 1905. So it was one night, Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt, when Roosevelt was president, came up with this great idea to conserve America's national forests. And primarily at the time, that reason was for watershed health, which a lot of people don't realize. And sure, it's for other economic opportunities, right? This is the Great West, so range, mineral extraction, but it was really all about having water available, water quality, water volume, and healthy forests and healthy people. And so I'm glad I still get to do that 100 years today. And so for those folks who are familiar with the Forest Service and its mission, it's caring for the land and serving people. And so that's what I get to do as a forest supervisor every day. So the San Bernardino National Forest, it's about 838,000 acres rounding up. We have in holdings within it. Um, but it is California, Southern California's backyard. Um, for those of all folks who are familiar, there are 18 national forests in California. There's 100 and something of them across the country. So we've got quite a bit here in this state, but it is a pretty big, large state. And I say national forest, we do a big part to, I would say, support or to feed into the fact that California is the sixth largest economy in the world. So when we talk about having 838,000 acres out there for conservation purposes, so not only for clean air and clean water, for recreational opportunities, this really is how many, 10 million, 15 million people's backyard right here. And if you count San Diego, because people still come up from there, it's even bigger than that. People come down from Vegas to be in the coolness in the mountains. We're everyone's backyard for 200 and 300 miles, right? In every single direction. We're a destination for us. We're a lot of places people visit for the day. So when you come to Southern California and you're skiing on National Forest System lands.
This is a really important point that a lot of people don't know, is that Big Bear Lake, Big Bear Resort, where people go snowboarding and skiing, is within the boundaries of the national forest. So when you say it is Southern California's backyard, we really do mean it. And tell me if I'm wrong. I think I read somewhere that this is the most highly used, especially on a weekend type basis, national forest in the nation, or at least close to the top. Is that true?
That's true. So here's the thing that is absolutely a fact. We're the most urban forest in the country. So whether it's a national forest, whether it's a national park, or it's some other public land management agency, and we have lots of private forests in this country that we benefit from. We are literally the most urban forest. So we have about 7.5 to 8 million people that live within those congressional boundaries. And so a lot of places, when you think about a forest, you think of this rural setting, but it's where I say the city meets the country. So if you ever hear that wild and urban interface, this is where it all comes together. And so we have people and communities and infrastructure right there with the wild, and so with the trees and the potential for all the things that come with it, not only those recreational opportunities, the catastrophic wildfire. And as you know, since we're going to be talking about water issues today, the things that result from catastrophic wildfire, including catastrophic flood.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. And we will get back to that because that is one of my big questions for you is what is a healthy, resilient San Bernardino National Forest and why is that important? But first, I want to go back to your story because you are one of my inspirations. I want to talk a little bit about how did you get here? So I'm guessing I tried to find a list of forest supervisors from all over the country, but USDA isn't exactly putting that out on the website very much. So I wasn't able to find that. But so I would guess that you're probably one of not a ton of female minority national forest supervisors, because I think the same with biology, that is my background. A lot of times there's not a lot of diversity in the people getting the degrees that lead to those kinds of jobs. So again, I'm kind of in the same boat, very rare to find a biologist as a general manager of a California water agency. And so, how did we get here? What were the things in our life that caused us to say, oh, I want to have this career in the natural resources that then led to the choices that you get to make throughout a career? So, where did you get your start? Like, what did your journey look like to get to the place that you are now? And I know you've worked on a lot of forests, but where did it all start? Because I know we have a common background in rural Alabama.
So that is where it starts. So I am from Macon County, Alabama. I'm from a town called Tuskegee, Alabama. Some people have heard of, they've seen the movie The Tuskegee Airmen. So I come from a place that is steeped in history, culture, around civil rights issues, but also is a part of what people call the Black Belt. So it's that beautiful layer of beautiful topsoil that grows cotton and peanuts and soybeans throughout the South. And I'm from a heavily agricultural, rich, right, landscape is where I'm from. So essentially, I grew up barefoot, footloose and fancy free.
Pine
As
forests.
Pine Forest as a country girl, so loblolly, long leaf, some short leaf, and every now a little bit of Virginia pine in some places. So a little reminiscent of here, different pine trees, taller pine trees, but definitely pine forest. And I'm a forester by trade, right? So I have my undergraduate degree in forest resource management and my master's in urban forestry. So I grew up with trees and the outdoors in my backyard, and it's the things that I guess you don't realize you take for granted. So I grew up literally outdoors, outside, breathing fresh air. I won't tell you what the bottom of my feet look like from being a barefoot little country girl, but I would say being outdoors was something that was kind of always inherent to me. And I'm from the South, so land management, growing crops, hunting, right? It's all things that, believe it or not, that are benefits that you can reap from your national forest, which I wouldn't find out for years later. But that's where it started for me. It's just a love of being outdoors. And I won't say a love, it was just it's how you lived. It's a
So, can you
lifestyle.
describe for me how it feels? Because, I spent a lot of time in Louisiana who has similar type pine forests, gopher, tortoise, red-caccaded woodpecker, lots of pine needles on the ground. So, can you just describe for me like how it felt when you were a little girl out in the forest and what that felt like to you that made you have a love to become a forester? Because that's actually a very rare career path for a young woman, of our generation, at least. I hope that changes over time. But like, what ignited that passion for you?
So it's the sense of like, I don't know, I don't think the word of being free is the right word. It's just, how do I say this? Outdoors, you don't have to worry about if you belong or acceptance, right? I mean, because that is that feeling of peace, like I should be here. It just doesn't come with strings attached, and it's easy, right? Just easy to catch your breath in nature. It's easy to get away from stuff, and it is that feeling of home. And so, when I say literally, when you grow up and you're only indoors when you have to be, you may not realize it, but it might be a natural career choice. But more specifically about how I would say fell into forestry. So just because you grow up outside doesn't mean you understand what it means to have a career outdoors. you probably take it for granted. So you're not pursuing a career because it's just what you do, right? It's what you do after school, it's what you do on the weekends, it's what you do before and after church, it's just what you do. And when I graduated from high school, so I'm from the South, so like you, that very Southern upbringing, and you know how it is, you got very few options. You're going to get a job, or you're going to go to school. Oh, those might just be your two options. And I was 18 years old, and my mom said, "You're not going to just hang around this house." And so Tuskegee, Alabama is home to the smallest, so the San Bernardino National Forest, the most urban national forest. The Tuskegee National Forest is the smallest one in the country. And so, you know how mamas are, they'll trot you down in anybody's office and say, go talk to them. And so that's what she did. And I ended up getting a summer internship, well, they call it a seasonal position. That's what we call it now, 1039s, but a seasonal job working in the Pacific Northwest. And I'll tell you, the first 6 months of that, I was doing trail work, hated it. I was miserable. Who wants to do this? It rained all day long.
I was going to say, very different type of forest. I used to live in Bellingham, so I know exactly where you were
Yes.
working on the Baker
Yeah, Mount Baker
National Forest, right?
Snoqualmie National Forest,
Yeah,
right?
so Pacific Northwest, raining, foggy all the time, cold even in the summer, lots of pine, but a different type of pine, lots of fir and, Pacific Northwest conifer forest, as you can imagine it. So you're out there on the trails and you're thinking to yourself, what have I done?
What have I done? Or no, more specifically, what has my mother done to me? When can I get out of here? And I think I was about 6 or 7 weeks in. And so one of the things that just made it so miserable, because when it just rains all day and that's it doesn't matter, sun up to sundown. So you're doing all your work in the rain. Your feet, speaking of feet, the condition of your feet and the wet socks and all the moleskin you have to use to try to keep your feet together because they're raw and they're rubbing. That's what I'm saying, like miserable. And eating a soggy sandwich in the rain every day, right? And then it was one day, I think it was around lunchtime, the rain stopped, the fog, because we were so socked in every day, dissipated. And little did I know those trails that are on every day, because you couldn't really see to the left or the right of you, the most phenomenal panoramic views. And I'm like, oh my God, is this what this is? Is this what's out here? And I was kind of hooked and suckered. So I was playing around between being kind of undecided because there was part of me that wanted to tap into this creative side and be a writer and all this other stuff. And there's part of me because I still have a love for animals. And I was half raised like a wild girl by one of my uncles who was a veterinarian. And so I was thinking about being a large animal vet because I'm from the South. I can tell you if your cow was pregnant, by the way, if you're wondering. And so that's what I thought. And that changed everything for me, Heather.
Yeah.
And I can't believe it. And so it was like, forestry, what's this thing? And I decided as a freshman in college, I would major in it. And if I hated it, and if it's okay for me to use 18-year-old speak, if it sucked, I would just change my major. And I guess it didn't.
Yeah. So here you are, 25 years later into your Forest Service career.
I don't know why you were dating this, Heather, but yes.
Well, I'm just saying. So I'm hoping that some young women and young people out there listen to this podcast and they become inspired. Because, like you, I spent a lot of time out in nature. When I was a kid, we went camping every weekend and I loved the streams. Like, I just wanted to be out in the stream, hopping along the rocks, seeing the fish, picking up rocks, seeing what's under them, all those kinds of things. And for me, it was a sense of peace and quiet. And, on the weekends, I just go out into the woods and traipse around and find overturned, trees that had fallen down and the amazing little hiding places they could have. And so I think when I think about the San Bernardino National Forest and the children who are in this area, like a lot of kids, they don't get out to the forest. They don't even get out in nature. But once they go, hopefully that spark is ignited like it was for us because it's such a rich and rewarding career. And, when you were on that trail crew, you probably had no idea that someday you would be sitting here as the forest supervisor talking to someone about your career and what it means to be a public servant, which I think is a big part of what both of us do. But it's that you don't know where you're going to end up when you start on this journey. And there are those horrible times. When I started my career, I worked in the salt marsh of South Louisiana, and my job was literally to count blades of grass out in a marsh, and I remember thinking to myself, like, why am I doing this? What is the point? And now looking back, well, A, it builds character. B, it's a really good story, but also it became the foundation of my understanding of lots of things related to climate science. And each step of the way, each of those jobs leads to the next job. And it's such an important part of career pathways and career trajectories and being part of and being, I would say, a steward of your own career in the fact that there will be these moments like your moment in, the Baker National Forest where all of a sudden the rain lifts and the fog's gone and you see this amazing view and you're like, oh, that's why I'm doing it. But you just can't see that from your perspective at that moment. And so I think you're a great example of why people should consider this career because you can have meaningful change and have a really rewarding time while you're a working professional and just it's so fulfilling in a way that I can't really think of many other careers that are fulfilling.
Yeah. I think exposure is so important. And funny enough, when you think about perspective, and I probably never thought about it till this moment, and it's pretty applicable to probably lots of things throughout my career. During those first 7 weeks I was in my misery, I probably couldn't see the forest for the trees. How ironic, right? But exposure is everything in access. So one of the reasons that I do what I do, and maybe I'll tell you a little about what, if anybody would even understand what it means to be a forest supervisor. So I talked before about how it's almost 840,000 acre forest. It is not the largest forest by far. There's some that are 4 million acres, but in comparison, what happens on every square acre in comparison is insane. So it is a land of extremes, right? And did you mention that land of extremes being in people's backyard? So I want to talk a little bit about, at least about exposure as someone who is a natural resource professional and manager. So I'm a forester by trade, but when I hear you talk about all those cool things you got to do, one of those things where you heard how I caught the bug, how I kept the bug is I got to dabble a little bit in your world. So I had those moments where I'm like, if I do one other survey of these culverts for this salamander that hasn't been here in 20, 30 years, right? Can you imagine that crawling through culverts? I did that, right? Or I got to spend a whole summer on a type 2 hand crew for wildland firefighting. So when our first responders are out here and they're out here, right? And this is Southern California, it is a part of our reality of understanding the importance of what they do behind that stuff. Working with fish crews and being out, and maybe because of some of the things I've done in my career, they've all come back to water. So I think about all the fun I've had out in streams and shocking fish. And yes, we do it. They survive. We're not killing the fish. I'm
Yes.
just counting the fish.
Love electrofishing,
Right.
one of my favorite
Right.
activities.
Doing things like that. And when I think about as a forester, one of my first big projects as a young forester in training and mentoring was actually a riparian project, large woody debris project, creating habitat, right? For somebody whose job was to think about trees. From all my different experiences, and again, it really all does come back to clean water. It was really all about everything. And that was one of the great things about exposure as just being a young adult, getting to work even temporarily for the agency, not even knowing I would do it permanently. But when I think about what's in people's backyard and we talk about not just exposure, but access, one of the other beautiful things about Southern California is it's also very affluent in some regards, but in other regards, it isn't. We have a lot of disparity here in our communities and with our economics. And our public lands are for the public. They're America's lands. So one of the things that's also important to me is we provide all these economic services, right? Ecotourism, but this is a privilege for everyone to enjoy. So having opportunities where people can come out. And so one of the great things about national forests that distinguish it from national parks, most of the things you do on us are absolutely free. And that's one of the things I'm the most proud of. So when we have such diverse communities like this, like we know there's places where it's economically depressed. And because environmental justice is so important, they still need those places where they get to cool off in the summer, right? They still need to get to be in places where the canopy is higher and they can feel a little more secure if there was wildfire that was to come through. They also get to have clean water, right? As an advantage to them. They get to have parks they get to recreate in. So environmental justice and doing this work in Southern California is that much more meaningful to me than being a practitioner, being a forest supervisor other places in the country
Yeah.
because of how special my backyard really is.
Yeah, if you go out on the weekends to Lido Creek, Mill Creek, Santa Ana River, and you can go out there and you just see families out there with a picnic, kids in the water. Now there's a lot of cost associated with that, which I know you have to deal with on a regular basis. But from the perspective of the American people, I think that that is such a value added to our society that you can, take your kids out for basically a half a tank of gas and get out there in the woods, go for a hike, have a picnic, have them again pick up the rock, see what's underneath. That could be a life-changing experience for a family or a young person in terms of what they might do with their life, the same as it was for us. And so I really appreciate that about the National Forest and the San Bernardino specifically. But let's talk a little bit about what else there is besides that, because that is one recreation. A lot of people don't understand or they don't realize that. So the National Forest has, in some forests, they do have a for-profit forestry that goes on. And so there's a lot of timber management. You have land management in terms of conservation, water resources management, grasslands management in some forests. You have the recreation, camping. How many campgrounds are there on the San Bernardino?
So in the San Bernardino, and then I don't want to, and I do not want to misspeak. I want to say for campgrounds, we have almost like 40 campgrounds.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's insane. And
Very
dangerous sites.
valuable
Yes.
to the people, right? Everyone, well, maybe not
Mhm.
everyone. A lot of people that I know, I should say, really like to go out and camping if they can get a campsite. So get out there in nature, spend time with their family. You also have community engagement and community affairs. Big Bear has a really awesome public interactive center that we've talked about
Yeah,
before.
the Discovery Center.
Yes, the Discovery
Yeah.
Center. So tell us a little bit about that.
So the Discovery Center. So for those folks who love to get up and enjoy the mountains, so especially if you're up in Big Bear or Lake Arrowhead, it's right there in Fawnskin. So I like to say it is the city of Big Bear adjacent, but literally it's right there on Big Bear Lake. You walk out of it and it's across. So it's a huge visitor center slash office. So we have administrative offices there, but we manage it with one of our partners, the Southern California Mountains Foundation. So people can come up. There's a big amphitheater out there. They bring children out there. You have interactive engagement with, you can hang out with a ranger and learn about the local animals and tree species and plant species. So they have interactive gardens behind there. They do music in the mountains, performances. So in the summer times, you can go have free music concerts on your national forest. And also it ties programs together between programs that we do for both adults and children, right? Conservation education programs there, and the work that we also do, which is not far away at our own children's forest. So we do a bunch of interpretive programs, and people can also come in and buy maps and T-shirts. Everybody likes a little bit of swag to commemorate their visit to National
Everybody loves
Forest.
Smoky.
And they get right Smoky, right? And so that is the home of Smoky. And they get to also visit with a lot of our scientists. So we have wildlife biologists and recreation managers and foresters and firefighters. We do a whole plethora of things. And so
Mhm.
people also get to engage with employees because it's where the public can come to learn, but also get to see where we work.
Yeah, I love that because in the end, we are public servants. And so you have to think about both the service side, but also the public side. And you can't really do that from behind your desk. So getting out there, I've been out there a couple times where there was lots of firefighters out there. I know you guys do seed propagation for your restoration, things like that. We've gone through the little children's forest activity center when our kid was little. And so it's just, again, this opportunity to engage and educate with the people about why the National Forest is important. But I also want to focus on one of the most astounding parts of your job, which is you also, well, you have a large staff, and a lot of it has to do with wildland firefighting. So these guys and women, in my experience, are just extraordinary. I cannot get over the job that they do. I'll be honest with you, I don't fully understand why. There definitely is a different mentality because these are the toughest of the tough people. When I worked at the Cleveland National Forest, I remember we went down to a forest meeting in San Diego, and everyone's introducing themselves, and they say, what do you do?" So I was like, "Oh, my name is Heather. I'm the fish biologist." And then we get to the firefighters, and they say, "Oh, my name is such and such. I work the rake." And it was the first time I ever realized and really it clicked that these people go out there in their full gear in the heat of the summer. They hike straight up a hill in a fire with like hand tools. And it blew my mind because I don't know, I guess I just always imagined, the loaders and the water trucks and the engines and the airplanes. And I didn't really fully understand that these people are fighting fires on our behalf to protect our communities with hand tools for the most part, you
It
know?
is sweat equity that gets the
Yeah.
job done, which a lot of people they don't realize because of course we have when it comes to wildland firefighting. So I'm so glad that you brought this up because it is a really big piece of my job and what we do here for the Forest Service is keeping communities safe, right? We have to. So, and it's not by keeping communities safe. Sure, it's property, but it's life, right? That's really important to us. And so you're right, sweat equity is a big part of it. So we have all types of tools in the toolbox. So this is the San Bernardino National Forest. We are here in Southern California. We talked about that it is the most urban. So because of that and all the people that live within the congressional boundaries, that is another part of the charge of what we do. And so, yes, it is natural resource management and protection, but it is also community protection is what we do as well. When we do that work through hazardous fuels reduction, and that hazardous fuels reduction reaps many benefits, and I'll get into that. But if I was just to simplify it, for what we have seen, and because you talked a little bit about climate, so what we've seen for climate change, we are seeing fires that are one, more numerous, right? So much more fire activity. We're seeing much larger fires. I mean, California is still, and I don't know if it wants to be famous for this, so far the only $1 million acre fire in its history, the Dixie fire, right?
Mm.
So fires are growing larger, and then the fire behavior has become that much more erratic, right? It's scarier fighting fire, and it's scarier having fire in your backyard. And so that's why for us to have the ability to go out and do manipulation in the landscape, because we've done it for hundreds of years, so we kind of got to do it now in these fire adapted ecosystems. But what we call reduce that fuel loading, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. What we're doing is we're not eliminating risks, but we're mitigating some of those risks, and we're making it easier and hopefully more defensible for our firefighters to be able to get in with those hand tools and that 40, 50 pounds of gear that they have on their back and defend people's homes and defend our habitat and our landscapes, right? To make it easier and safer for them to do their job. Because if we don't do some of that work, we can't even put people in there. And then this is the mountains. You've seen the type of ground it is, right? It's dangerous ground to be on for those folks. So they literally put their lives on the line in service to us. And it's pretty awesome and awe-inspiring. I did it for 4 months one time, and there's a reason I don't do it anymore. But I'm very thankful for them and proud of them. And even though they work for me, I'm so glad I get to work with,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hope that anyone who listens to this, the next time you see a fire on TV and you're seeing the video of the firefighters going out, in their gear, that you're realizing that they are putting their lives on the line 100%, but they're also very uncomfortable for very long shifts. That there nowadays isn't even a fire season. Sometimes, depending on where you are in the nation, it's year round, or you're traveling all over the world to go fight fires because all of the, globe is kind of struggling with these same things. These are real heroes. And, I hope that the young kids out there who want to be a firefighter, that they do consider wildland firefighting because it is just as heroic and just as important. And a lot of people just don't know about it unless you've been exposed to it. And they really are, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on my podcast, but they are badasses.
They are. Oh, for sure. Oh, they do badass work. And I'm just proud to say it. And I think you get to toot your agency's horns just a little bit when you get to do a podcast. But most people aren't aware that the U.S. Forest Service, I mean, we are the experts in the world, not even in the nation, in the world when it comes to wildland firefighting. So we train people. So you talked about it a little bit because people will watch the news when Canada's on fire. Australia, they have those vicious, every couple of years, vicious
Mhm.
fires in the outback. They've been seeing them, believe it or not, in Italy, sometimes in the wake of some of those earthquake events that they've been having, right?
Mhm.
Or I'm sorry, volcanic eruptions, not
Yeah.
earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, having wildfire in the wake of those. And so we train people internationally. And then even we do a lot of that work locally. So some of those folks that you see, they're also our friends in the fire service that also do a lot of great work to protect communities and others, especially our structural fire departments. We work with them hand in hand, but we also help train them on the wildland side
Yeah.
because it's literally what we do.
Yeah, they are amazing, and the system that you guys have in place is just really astounding, and I'm very grateful for that. So, can you talk a little bit about fire and the ecology of fire and kind of how we got to this place of fire related to ecosystem health? As you know, we're very concerned about our watershed, our headwaters. So 67% of our local water supply comes off the San Bernardino National Forest. And that's through the Santa Ana River, Mill Creek, Lido Creek, Plunge Creek, all the different creeks, tributaries to the Santa Ana River. Historically, that is why this valley was settled. And so we're very concerned and want to be proactive in making sure that we don't have catastrophic wildfire. That's not to say that we don't want to ever have fire, though. So, can you talk a little bit about maybe just touch on the history of the Forest Service in terms of how our viewpoints have changed regarding fire and what you think the future looks like in terms of um, fire management, fire prevention, and then also, how do we get out ahead of the tremendous fuel load that we have built up after, 100 years of suppression policy?
Yeah. So, well, then you gave me an actual good segue on that whole 100 years of suppression policy. And so I talked about how the wild and urban phase. So this was a big thing for our country over 100 years ago, right? Of settling the Great West. And so that was the thing. If you build it, they will come. That was the whole premise. Have people move out, whether it was the Oregon Trail, all the ways that people got out here, right to California. And of course, as we know, we already had people who were already here in California,
Yeah.
but we had already had Native Americans. And then people who were right, they were Native Californians who were here, even when we just said, hey, this is the United States. They're like, yeah, we've already been living here.
Hmm.
But I digress on that piece. But when people showed up and we started to build cities and communities, and did I mention the economics around that? This was in fire adapted ecosystems, right? Where for thousands of years, fires would start naturally, lightning caused fires, right? So we call those acts of God. And millions of acres would burn every year on a natural cycle, right? 7 to 10 year cycles of when you would see fire return to certain pieces of the landscape. That was what they call the fire return interval, the historic interval. Well, we interrupted that when people came into the landscape and we said, well, we can't have fire going across millions of acres. It'll burn people's homesteads that they just developed, their ranches, these towns that we just stood up. And so we're going to start fire brigades and we're going to start agencies. So that was part of what the Forest Service did when it was first started, was to put out wildfire. It was essentially to eliminate as best you could its existence from the landscape because of the danger we thought it posed at that time and not the understanding of knowing how to figure out how to actually live with fire
So
because it was
basically,
good
as
for the
soon as a
environment.
fire started, move in, put the fire
Fire
out.
out.
Uh-huh.
Right.
Okay.
And so that does things over time. Natural without fire was what I would say, like maybe the natural filter, the natural cleaner, right? For our forest and our landscape. So how do I say this? Keeping some of our forests more open and park like, keeping those canopies raised so when you had fire on the ground, it didn't have low hanging branches that it could just and take, and then you have canopy fire, right? That's what really makes those fires move fast when it really gets up in the trees. You have the ability for fire to stay low on the ground, do healthy things because these are fire adapted ecosystems. These plants and these animals out here in these forests, they're dependent on fire coming through naturally. So we rob the ecosystem of its ability to naturally cleanse itself and do regeneration as well.
Yeah, a lot of people don't really realize that one of the good things that come out of fire is that the understory basically is burned out, and so then there's more open area, which a lot of either native plants or animals need that open understory so that they can have habitat to live in. But as that all gets grown up, it's not as suitable anymore for the native. Whoever it might be, animals or plants, to be out there. And that also creates a tremendous fuel load. That is one of the reasons we've had these huge explosive fires, is because the understory has been so built up over decades. And that's how you probably get a 1 million acre fire, I would assume.
Right. And so even before I touch on fuel loading, here's one thing that sometimes people don't even put together. Take fire out of the equation. We just have a lot of trees up there now because remember, the forest is not allowed to naturally eliminate, create room and space for new trees to grow. All right. So that's what we do. And I'll touch on that a little bit more. These homogeneous landscape, even age kind of stands that are not good for us to have, because diversity in nature is just as important as it is when we're talking about diversity out in our communities and our workplaces. Diversity in nature is important, and we robbed it of that diversity. And so because of that, we have these places that are just overgrown. There are too many trees per acre. And we talk about the thing that's so valuable here in Southern California and water, those trees are sucking it all up.
Mm.
So I just wanted to put that out there because some people, yes, because of the fuel loading, it's so important that even if you take fire off the table, it's still so important for us to have healthy, resilient forests. And I know we're going to talk about that because of what it means for our water table. So now,
Yeah.
back to fuel loading.
Well, I was going to
Yeah.
ask you, so do you think that our marketing of what a forest looks like has kind of done a disservice, in that, in my understanding, what a, especially like a Southern California montane forest should look like, it's a mosaic of multiple species with open patches of space in between. However, whenever you see an advertisement for a forest, it's, a lot of very probably similar looking trees. They're all beautiful and green, and there's a symmetry of the forest. And so, do you think that we have convinced ourselves of maybe the wrong thing of what a healthy forest looks like?
I would say yes, our view is skewed. And, I don't want to get in trouble with people who have copyrights and people who we grew up watching their movies, right? But I mean, how we look at our natural environment and what it's supposed to look like, it might be a little bit of a fairy tale viewpoint,
Mm.
just to be honest
Mhm.
with you. For what we think is aesthetically pleasing, we haven't done enough to educate ourselves literally to understand just how unhealthy that is.
Right.
And then why maybe it's not as pretty as it seems, right?
Right.
For all the hidden dangers that it holds. Because when I go into some of these communities and we have them, they're indicative of all our mountain communities across the board. While it's so beautiful to just be standing in some of these yards or some of these parks where you were just closed and inundated with all these large trees, that is a huge wildfire problem for us, right? And so when you talk about the need for defensible space, when you hear people say that, they're really talking about reducing the number of trees that you have. We just have way too many
Yeah.
per acre than we're ever meant to be there because we've eliminated fire, right? And then some of the things that we've done in return, like clear places for development. Well, we don't want to all, right? We still got to still have some trees in it, right? Intermixed in between that. And so we have to get back to having a healthy balance, and we have an unhealthy balance out there because of all those activities for people moving in and all the things that we did in response, including eliminating fire. So going back to that fuel loading. So because of that, when fire goes in and I'm going to hone in on that a little bit. When it goes in and continues that, what we call that mosaic, it is important to have so for people who like to go hunt, because it's hunting season right now, I know that's a big deal. Having different habitat is important. So as a biologist, you know this, having habitat for cover, having habitat for forage. Those are all different requirements. It doesn't all look the same. So for someone who likes to hunt and just or someone who likes to bird watch, just having different habitat is important just for your hobby, right? Just to even have the bike ride, just to have different scenery to look through. That's pretty important. Um, for those places where you talked about, and a lot of people like Lido Creek and you who's growing up wanting to put your feet in the water in those streams, having those cool places to go and having just enough trees for that, that's important for those riparian areas. But once you get out of that, right, it becomes a little too much. Yeah. And so what we're seeing with the places where historically you might want to see 20 trees per acre, we've got 500 trees per acre.
Wow.
Those are our national forests that we have out there right now. So when we talk about what's all our charge and our responsibility, one is understanding how important it is to treat to maintain healthy forests, that cutting trees is an okay thing. Mm-hmm. What we don't want to do is eliminate trees from the landscape, but having a healthy balance trees, right? So it's the healthy balance of nature. That was what we're trying to achieve and strive for. So getting back to historically, what it should look like in having 20 trees per acre.
Yeah. What does a healthy, resilient San Bernardino National Forest look like to you?
Right. So believe it or not, it looks in a lot of places way more park-like than what it does now. Can you imagine forests where you can get off the trail and you can literally just walk, as we like to say it, just cross country, off path, right? Get off the beaten path, be able to walk through your tree, right? Walk through your forest and navigate them, right? Where the trees are big in size and wide apart and they're huge canopies, right? But there are places where there are openings. And you see the small baby trees, the recruits coming in. So where you actually see mixed age classes of species, where you see more than just, right? Because of what we're seeing now, because we have even age, that's what we're calling when all the trees are the same age. You're seeing that in everything else. So all the herbs and other grasses that are grow, either they're being eliminated because all these big trees are crowding them out. They're taking their sunlight, they're taking their water. So we're even losing out on some of the other plants and animals that are supposed to be present.
Our meadow systems, are meadow systems part of the San Bernardino National Forest historically? Because I don't see that many very often anymore.
So we have a lot of meadows if you were to look at the map, right? Mm-hmm. On a map we do, but when you walk out there because of all that encroachment. So when I talk about the sheer number of trees, because I've seen it, it's a really cool thing when we're actually able to do prescribed fire. So when we're actually able to, as humans, right, we start the ignition, right? We create that flame and that spark and we burn to kind of mimic some of those natural burning conditions in the right time of year. Metals naturally burn. And that's how you would keep some of those trees from getting, what is the word that I'm established, right? And growing and sucking up the water table, because that water is there, right? For some of the grasses and herbs and smaller flowering species that are native to those meadows and not those trees.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is that we need to get back to a system as opposed to, it's not really the definition of monoculture because we don't have a for-profit forestry like a lot of other forests do, but in terms of the, many trees, not as many maybe understory shrubs or meadows or other types of systems, the resilience comes from the diversity of components within the system. And especially when it comes to water, a lot of people don't think about the fact that there is no forest without the water resources that support it, but there also is not a sustainable, reliable water resource without the forest because it is part of what holds our water on the mountaintops through snow, snowpack. But as the snow melts and it flows down, there's a lot of purification that happens. There's, a lot of different function of the water going through the forest that the forest benefits, but also the water sustains the forest. And that's systemic thinking, which I think for maybe many years, we haven't really done a lot of that. It's been very compartmentalized and not knocking NEPA or anything, or our federal regulations. But I think part of it we've been forced to compartmentalize how we think about resources because of our environmental documentation that we need to do, when in reality, it is a system of systems. And that's what, when I think about a resilient forest, that's what I imagine is a functional system of systems that has cycles. And sometimes it's going to be amazingly beautiful. And then sometimes there's going to be a fire. And for the 5 years after the fire or 3 years after the fire, it's going to look a little messy, a little dirty, a little depressing. but that is part of the cycle of many of these adapted systems that are natural to our area. And I think the more we can educate on that, maybe the more acceptance we will get in terms of fire, because fire is scary,
Oh, yes, it
but it
is.
is necessary, right? So how can
Yeah.
we provide safety, but also bring that component of fire back to our forests
So that
health?
so that makes me think of a couple of different things, Heather. And so I'm going to ask you a question because you could probably articulate this for people way better than I could because this is your jam and your jelly. Um, when you think about or when you hear people talk about why the Amazon is so important, why is that?
The Amazon forest,
The Amazon rainforest.
it is well, historically it has been like the lungs of our globe. It's so massive and it has so many trees, and trees take the carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere and provide oxygen. So that's one of the most fundamental things. Also, huge water provider for, a lot of the globe. But also the diversity. So, there's many species of birds that go back and forth. Birds, they transport a lot of different things. Again, these aren't one element that is in isolation. It is how everything works together. And so the Amazon and the function of a forest that provides oxygen out into the world is so important because that is a provider of many, many other living things. And so it makes me sad when I see people burning the Amazon on purpose, for the sole purpose of creating pastures for maybe grazing animals or something like
Yeah,
that,
like
right?
that. So the reason I asked you that, Heather, is because so when you talk about like the need for us to do education, yes, but for people to get it, San Bernardino Mountains, our southern montane forest, these are our Amazon. And that's why I asked you that. And here's the scary part because I think when you say the Amazon that helps people get it, we're losing our Amazon at a faster rate than they're losing theirs.
Wow, I didn't know that.
So, going back to that whole piece about catastrophic fire and what does it mean to have a resilient, healthy forest? So, you talked about after you have a fire, right? It's not so pretty afterwards. It will be, hopefully, eventually. It's the ability for all those systems to rebound and be able to do it together. That we still have the ability to sustain and maintain a forest. So, when I talk about striking that balance, it is one, bringing down that fuel load and making forests healthier and more resistant to catastrophic wildfire because fire should be in those forests so that when fire goes through, it's at low to moderate intensity. So it does that natural cleanup for us, right? And those forests and those trees are still there. But without our ability to go in and do that hazardous fuel reduction, so let return some of that water back to the water table, have some of that diversity, break up some of the purposely, right? We need to right? Fragment some things that sometimes purposely make sure there's heterogeneity in species and habitat. But at the same time, we've got to be able to treat to make sure we have those things, but we can't not treat because if fire comes and takes it all out, then there's nothing left. And so that's what I mean by the balance, because fire has to be in the ecosystem. It just means when the fire comes through, we have to make sure we do all that preventative work ahead of time to make sure that everything else is going to stand in its wake. And so that's why it's so important to break it down because this is our Amazon and we got to do everything we can to hang on to it.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this first episode of Watershed Moments podcast. Be sure to come back for part 2, where we will continue the conversation with Dee Dee Harrison, diving deeper into the partnerships that shape the future of our watersheds and forests. This discussion is a great reminder that really hard does not equal impossible, especially when we're willing to work together for transformational change. If you like what you heard today, be sure to like, follow, and share with a friend. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and thank you for being part of our Watershed Moments.